actually, is this the image that you're recording? Like
Yes,
this
yes.
cut out? Okay.
Okay, this is Dennis Young here, podcast number 29, and a very special guest, Arnold Dreyblatt. And it's a pleasure to have you on here. You're such an innovative artist over the years. And maybe we could start off, but how you got interested in music, and we could take it from there.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know how much detail you want, but I could tell some stories.
Sure, absolutely.
How much time do we have?
Well, we got an hour, so if you
Okay,
have time,
okay,
we
okay. I
plenty of
get it.
time.
Right. So I was a student in the media department at in the University of Buffalo. It was in the early '70s, and mid '70s, a very interesting place for experimental film, for early video art, and also for contemporary music. And I took part there in some. Actually, was called June in Buffalo. Was quite famous in Buffalo. Kind of residency program. Head of the department was the composer Morton Feldman, with whom I have some connections through my family, and
Okay.
which is a whole nother story. But I went there actually to study with Woody and Steina Vasulka, who came to do a presentation where had been an undergraduate, and I okay, just to say a few words about them. They founded the Kitchen, very early video artists, and they worked a lot with in analog electronics, the
Got it.
transference of connecting or interfaces between audio, sound, and video, which is basically was all analog electronics. So they were a very important influence on me. And then I was lucky in, I guess, let me think, '74, June '74, to take a seminar, which was a month with Pauline Oliveros, who I consider my first music teacher in a
Right.
way. I mean, I didn't come from a music background,
Okay.
other than and spending a lot of time at the Fillmore East and in the '60s
Oh,
when I
okay.
was in high school. And so Pauline Oliveros, and then, and of course, Feldman. In the second summer, John Cage came. It was a very active place. I also spent some time with a composer, Joel Chatterby. He's not very well known, but he died recently.
No, never heard of him.
He was a early electronic music composer, or relatively early. Very good teacher. I think it was from him that
Okay.
I really understood like analog systems. So it was about energy, about working with, understanding frequency and amplitude, which was my entry into music. So not
Okay.
necessarily through, playing an instrument. And then I started working in video with stroboscopic images. Interesting that I met Tony Conrad came to visit. He later taught there, but he
Okay.
came to visit while I was there. He was then teaching in Antioch, but he later was taught many years in Buffalo until he died. And I probably did some of the very earliest stroboscopic periodic video
Oh,
work.
about that.
And in '74, '75, the story was I was in this world. I did some works with sine waves, an installation with sine waves in '75, and then I was in at a party by the filmmaker Hollis Frampton's house, and I was sitting on a chair next to a bookcase, and I would always look at the books, and I found
All
a
right.
copy of Selected Writings from Monte Young.
Oh,
Uh,
about that.
and he saw that I was, deeply reading it, and he gave it to me, that copy. And so as time, I tended to just kind of move quickly.
Hmm.
And I finished school, went back to New York, where I grew up, And then I saw there was a Monte Young concert, and then I approached him and spent some time as his student over 2 years.
Wow.
So that was one aspect. I also, just to kind of fill out my background, I also studied with Alvin Lucier at Wesleyan University. In that period, Wesleyan and Mills College, which now died, were the two least academic centers for this kind of, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. We used to call it downtown new music, but this doesn't mean anything anymore. But kind of non-academic experimental music. And I spent a number of years then in New York, developing my own kind of path, working with tuning, taking apart instruments, musical instruments, trying to understand how musical instruments functioned. And also, I came eventually to a point where I understood that, or at least a model for me, and coming from my background in understanding sound, was string vibration. And then I started vibration, because with strings, I used to call it a kind of a geometry you can hear. You divide it in the middle, you divide it in thirds. It's like it's a science or an understanding that was very well known in ancient Greece, and also in ancient China, the two world civilizations, and also in a lot of folk music. So I began then deriving a tuning system based, not to get too technical, based on my experiments, and founded the first ensemble. It was clear to me at some point, for a reason that I can't really tell you, that I wanted to work with acoustic instruments, amplified, that I wanted to form a band. Yeah. So the whole issue that one could talk about, why a band. And so I formed the first ensemble, the Orchestra of Excited Strings, in 1979. Actually had my first solo concert, began working with my signature instrument, the double bass with fitted with music wire, and my technique playing, which I started to work on at that time. I chose a double bass because it has a very long speaking length. It's no longer really a double bass the way I was using it. So I developed that also. The first performance was in '79, and then and then that was quickly followed by the first ensemble concert. So
now I found out.
Concert, I just want to say this: the first ensemble concert of the Orchestra of Excited Strings was at Phil Niblock's loft in 1980.
Now I found out about you. I read a book of Tim Lawrence about Arthur Russell.
Yeah. Oh, right.
And that's how I saw your name. I said, I got to speak to you, because there must have been some really great shows, maybe at the Kitchen. Did you?
Well, I knew Arthur. Unfortunately, I met Arthur only a few years before I left the States. Because I've been based in Europe. I've been based mostly in Berlin since the early '80s, and I met him, I don't know, 79, 80, in this period. A few years before I left. He was a very specific personality.
Yeah, I know.
And person, very unusual person, and very special. It's crazy that he's gotten so well known. And
I know. It's like that, right?
Yeah, but okay, that we could talk about that later.
Keep going. Keep going.
Talk about him. So
sure.
Yeah, I think that Arthur, one of the interesting things about Arthur was that he really didn't care about genre. So for him, he was active in what I would call kind of experimental end of the disco scene.
Yeah, that's right.
He performed at Phil Niblock's loft and other spaces downtown, kind of experimental music context. He performed with Allen Ginsberg for many years.
Right.
And had studied Indian music. it was a very wide interest, and he improvised with a number of different musicians, also often mixing the worlds that they came from. When he died, I happened to be visiting New York
Oh,
when
okay.
he died of AIDS, and there was an event at Phil Niblock's loft where people came from these different worlds, and they all kind of looked at each other like, "Well, who the hell are you?"
Oh, how about that?
So,
That must have been
so,
something.
that's kind of
Wow.
interesting. So, and yeah, he was very open to me. I loved his solo work with his cello, and played through some simple electronics, those simple songs. Uh, I mean, it's one of the reasons that music keeps coming out, because I keep as
Right.
I think a lot of people notice, is constantly uh, um, new versions of pieces and new works coming out, because he had difficulty finishing things. And
Mm.
so when he died, he left all these tapes,
Wow.
unfinished tapes, multi-track tapes and things. So it's taken a long time to go through all that material. But
I love the record World of Echo. I love. It's a
yeah,
great
World of Echo,
record.
yeah, it's great.
Beautiful record.
And there's a also a film documentation that Phil Niblock shot. It's probably on the
Oh,
internet.
okay. I got to
Yeah,
see that.
yeah.
So continuing your career, so you went to Germany after New
Well,
York and then
I was performing downtown, and
okay.
it was actually Phil Niblock that was partially responsible for my um, leaving this, well, not leaving the States, but my first trip to Europe, sorry, from the States. He, he helped. Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where I kept noticing everybody was going to Europe, and
Hmm.
it was very difficult in the States back then. I found, it was basically this tiny scene downtown. It's not related to what the world is like now. There was no internet. It was very hard to perform outside of New York. I mean, it was basically the East Coast and the West Coast, and
Right. I'm sure.
expensive to travel, and so it was clear to me after a while that that Europe was offering something else, that it was possible to, because so decentralized, to play in all these different countries, and there was a lot of interest. And
Right.
so I think it was in '83, fall of '83, I made my first trip. I had some support from a foundation also to pad it, and I had a number of solo concerts set up that Phil helped me with, and I ended up staying for almost 6 months. So I just kept
Wow.
getting more
Hmm.
things, traveling around.
Right.
I went to Berlin, I think after a few weeks, to visit my old friend Yoshi Wada, who's died not so long ago. His son Tashi Wada is very active as a composer himself. Yoshi had a grant in Berlin. There's especially at that time, it was very important, the Berlin Artist Program, which invited a lot of artists and composers from the States to Berlin. This is the old West Berlin. And so I came there, and there seemed to be a lot of a tremendous amount of interest in the world that I was coming from,
Hmm.
and then I traveled around Europe, and kept bouncing back to Berlin, and then decided that it might be an interesting place to be. So, which a lot of other young people today have decided to, but from
I'm
the States,
sure.
it's still with Americans. But at that time, there weren't that many, and but it was a very interesting situation also with the sort of, I don't know, tale of two cities. So having the East Bloc and the
Oh
Western
yeah.
world in one
Oh,
city
oh yeah.
was very interesting. And in that first trip, I traveled a lot in Eastern Europe, and also made contacts with like-minded young people in Prague and Budapest and so forth. So I got a grant for 1 year to come to
Oh,
Berlin,
okay.
and yeah, and now
You've still been
a
there,
long
right?
time. Yeah, I
Wow.
actually, I was there for that 6 months. I came back. I think I came back to New York in must have been spring of '84. I had that time, I had a bar in Williamsburg. I mean, it was a
Oh,
Williamsburg that's unrecognizable now. It was on Kent Avenue on the water,
Oh, okay.
in a storefront. There were very few people from Manhattan at that time,
I'm
and
sure.
I kind of packed up and came then for a year, and then I extended that to 2 years. I had a studio in I don't know how well you know New York, but that is something PS1, maybe you know, in
Oh,
this
yeah, I've heard of that place, right?
this artist. So there's something like that in Berlin, Kunsthaus Britannien. I had a residency there, or for a year, and I ended up extending that. So it just it got infinitely extended.
Well, in Europe, they're more open, I guess, to more experimental music. Is that what is happening? Why you did that, or because the Europeans are more open to your
Well, I
type of
mean,
music
it's really hard to say.
and art?
In some respects, at that time, I felt that there was a tremendous amount of interest in the New York scene. There were a lot
Right,
of people coming over, and there were a lot of festivals, but there wasn't really a homegrown scene there. So it was still quite academic. So that's kind of a weird kind of dichotomy, that there's kind of these two. On one hand,
right,
it's a bit
of course.
schizophrenic, but yeah, I felt like maybe also I grew up in New York, and a lot of my colleagues in New York had come from somewhere else. Maybe I felt like I needed to be able to go somewhere too. I mean, at that time, I just needed to live somewhere else, and to leave my hometown for a while. It's very hard to leave New York.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
imagine.
and it was also not a. People always ask me, "How could you have left New York?" But it was a very hard time. I felt. I mean, not a positive time. It was this kind of crack period.
Oh,
It was
yeah,
the Ford to New York drop dead period. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. There was this
yeah.
headline, and yeah, it was getting a bit dangerous, and okay, if I would say that prices were going up, it would sound ridiculous now, because of course
Oh,
not
yes.
in terms of where it is now, but I remember coming back a few years later when Arthur died, and the whole AIDS thing hit.
Yeah,
I remember people just saying, "Don't even think of coming back here." It's hard to imagine that in New York, but
right,
once
right.
I saw I was kind of I was able to live, on my work. I didn't have a day job, you
That's
know.
great.
I told them, I'm as poor as you are, but I don't have a day job.
That's great.
so,
Well, you're
so
very fortunate that
back
you
then,
make a
and
living on what you love doing.
so I also, I should say that, okay, because my background was also more in the visual arts and media arts, and I came back to that. So I also, I had a kind of a hiatus or break when I was starting to develop my music, and I went back to that. So I started active in the I guess late '80s, '90s, with installations and performances, media performances. I spent a lot of time. I continue to spend a lot of time in Eastern Europe,
Wow.
and in the '80s, and then the '90s, I did some pieces also related to that, and to history was my interest in history, and eventually I ended up as a professor in an art school. So I retired 2 years ago. I'm 70 now. I
Oh,
retired two
wow.
years ago
Huh.
from teaching in an art school in Germany, in Kiel, which is a city near the Danish border. So I would commute from
Now,
Berlin.
how hard was it to learn the language, though? Did you know German
Oh, no,
before?
no.
You must
I
have taken a
probably
while,
understood a
right?
little bit from Yiddish, but I no, it's a very difficult language.
I'm sure
Actually,
it
I have
is.
to say that I spoke some broken German in the early days in the '80s, but I really learned when I started spending a lot of time in East Berlin. So in the late
Mm,
'80s, and then as the wall opened, I had a number of friends there, also in the art scene, music scene, and it was because they couldn't in West Berlin at that time, all young people spoke English because they had grown up on AFN, if you know what that is.
right, right.
And it was kind of a colony of the States. So it was very difficult. People would just switch to English as soon as you started to try to speak German. But in East Germany or East Berlin, they were forced to learn Russian, and they had
Oh, okay.
very few people who could speak English. So that kind of forced me to,
Yeah, you had to learn.
and socially, I think I took a few courses in the late 80s, but it was really, I learned on the job, so to say. And, but it's a difficult language. I mean, I can't write very well, but I taught in German, for
That's amazing.
13
That's great.
years, yeah,
Wow.
as a professor. So I managed that somehow. Yeah.
Now, were these installations at galleries, or they had museums, or
Sorry.
where did you do the installations you did? Were they at like galleries or museums,
Well,
or?
there's a number of different. You can see this on my website because it's
Okay,
divided music
I
and
saw a
arts.
little bit of it.
On my website, I mean, so there's installations in galleries and in museums. There's public art pieces, often a result of competitions,
Okay,
public art competitions that I won. I've been involved in a number of them over the last few years. That's a category. Performance. I've done a lot of different types of performance works. I work a lot with text, with historical texts, and so it's not one thing, So
that's great.
it's
Yeah, you got to be
very many different media. In some cases, my music is also involved, but not in all cases. Yeah.
right.
So yeah, that's developed over the years. In fact, when I was teaching, I did some work. I think when I was teaching, because it was an art school, but related to art practice, I spend more of my when I would speak about sound, it would be more in the direction of sound installation, because that's sort of also a category that's developed over recent years in the art world. So and often with in the visual or in the media arts or media installation, sound is often kind of an add-on, like an accompaniment, and it's not really considered in itself. So that was a focus among others. But yeah, I was very, I'm very grateful that I had that chance to also to teach. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Now, do you write music and read music, or is everything just eat by ear?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. It's not so
Okay,
simple because I really have no well, I would say that I have no conservatory training,
right,
and I don't know, I took some lessons when the Beatles came out and things, guitar lessons,
right.
but I can't, I really couldn't was not trained in that way, and so I came in through, I always say, through the language of acoustics into music, into sound, and then into music, and really developed my own music, my own tuning, my own system. So I actually also developed my own notation for,
Wow.
okay, usually not a rhythmic notation,
Okay.
but a notation for the musicians that perform with me. They kind of
Oh,
had to
got
learn
it.
my language. Yeah. That's gotten much easier now because many young people have in their toolkits uh, working with different intonations and different tuning systems. But at that time when I started, there were very few musicians who had any idea about that.
Yeah, well,
So
I think it's better that you didn't have formal training, because you developed your own sound. I think if you had formal training, you'd be more focused on doing traditional music. Because I never had any. I don't read or write music either, and I don't know. I
well,
think
yeah, well, I think that the situation now has changed because of technology. So laptops and everyone,
right.
was making music based related to sound, but that was not the case when I started. So it was not so easy. So not everyone, respected what I was doing because I thought, okay, he's just not one of us, so to say. So, but I kept at it, and I have then, as software came out, I then have composed some pieces in standard notation. I mean, I figured out or at least I developed my own way of notating that. So to
That's
the
great.
nearest equal tempered pitch, but with the tuning information and sense. and also the name of what I call it based on the harmonic series. So I have there, there's a string quartet, an octet. There's been a number of pieces, but I, even though I was invited a number of times to compose for other ensembles, in terms of actually just giving a finished score, and even in that case, I'd have to have somebody clean it up, because no matter what I do on the computer, it's not going to be in the the way people want to see it. And the situation where you give off a score and expect someone to play it, I learned my hard lesson that I have to be there, because just the rhythms and to play the pitches is not really the music. In my case, I have to be there. I have to work with the musicians. It's very much about the sound that I'm looking for, and combined with the tuning system. And you can't really write that, or at least I haven't found a way to write that. As an example, I used to write on these scores, what you're supposed to put the dynamics in the beginning of the score, and I would write no dynamics, but they would just ignore that, because they never heard of that. How could you play music without dynamics?
Right, of course.
They would introduce dynamics into it.
Now, what about Rhys Chatham? Did you do any work with Rhys Chatham?
I knew Rhys. I still know Rhys. I mean, I haven't seen him in a while. Occasionally he comes to Berlin. Okay, he was actually from that scene. There was Rhys Chatham and Glenn Branca.
Right, I know.
Actually, a third one. There was also Jeffrey Lawn at that time. He's not as well known. Rhys, of course, he comes from a family of artists, and before he started playing electric guitars, he was in the experimental music scene. He also, I think he was a student of Lamont's before me.
How about that?
So he could bridge that gap, whereas Glenn came completely from outside the music world, or he came more from theater. So I had contact with him back then. Yeah, he actually even gave me. He programmed me at the Mud Club.
How about that?
And I was the last act to play the Mud Club.
Oh, really? Wow, we played the Mud Club, Liquid. Now, we played with Rhys in 2010 at Lincoln Center outside, and it was this 100 guitar.
Oh, you did the guitar thing, right?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
That was pretty wild.
And you yourself, what do you play? Or
I played marimba. I played drums. I play a lot of instruments, but back then it was with the band Liquid. It was marimba, rototoms, percussion. And
that's
we were very unique. And we were at 99 Records, which Glenn was on.
Yes, of course, that's true.
Glenn was the first record on 99.
99, I remember. And you also have a 99 record. I think I remember the name. Yeah.
We had 3 EPs, and people are still playing our music. I guess because it was so original. It's amazing, 40 years later, and we're still getting play. So we must have did something good.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear that. I'll look. Is this online? I guess I can.
Yes. You could find us. Just look up Liquid, the band, and you'll see all our music. I'll send you a couple songs. We had a big hit song that was stolen from us, White Lines by Grandmaster Flash. And then when that was taken, they took the bass line, they took a lot of the song, and after that, 99 went out of business, the record company, and that was it.
Yeah.
And then we had a few reunions, and that's how I met Rhys, and we went over to Berlin a few times. One show and done. It's the strangest thing. One show, and the next day we left to come home. So it was kind of strange, but
when was that?
2010.
Okay.
And then also 2003 we did that.
Okay.
So it was very strange. But we had one-off shows in Europe and came back.
So who else was in the band?
What's that? Well, we had a singer, South Principato, Scott Harley on drums, and Richard McGuire, who's who's a famous illustrator now. He's done books. He's doing a movie. He's going to be, his book here is going to be now part of a movie.
Interesting.
So
do you remember Jeffrey Lawn?
No, I don't remember him.
Interesting, because he was around also that time. playing also the same places. Yeah. So,
Okay.
but he disappeared. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So what's the next
So
question?
next thing, what about your current projects? I mean, we could go a little. You want to do into the 2000s, or you want to go into like what your current projects are, what you're working on?
Okay, there's a number of different areas. So the Orchestra of Excited Strings still exists. We just recently last year, finally an album came out of this band on Drag City,
Okay.
and called Resolve. And the lineup is with Orrin Ambashi, who many have heard of, and
Oh yeah.
who lives in Berlin now. Konrad Sprenger and Joachim Schutz. So there's that band. Then I have a solo project,
Oh, great.
which I've been performing a lot in Europe. I just came from a tour in the States,
Oh wow. How about that?
where yeah, it was varied. So I West Coast and on the East Coast. But I also do projects where I work with local musicians and kind of make some pieces. So with them, so I was at the Music Gallery in Toronto,
Oh wow.
and in New York at Artist Space for the final concert. I performed with a member from my ensemble, a very old friend, Konrad Sprenger, in New York at Artist Space. It's just a few weeks ago, actually. So.
Now, how do you get these shows? You have a manager that
Yes,
arranges?
I do. I work with Front Porch, Regina Green, and who's this is the second tour of that. I'm kind of too old for real heavy touring, but
Okay.
I enjoy to get to the States. In Europe, it's often one-off thing. So I have a
Right.
concert, for instance, this coming weekend in Marienbad, so in
How about
Czechoslovakia,
that?
in Czech Republic, at the film festival. I'm also showing a film of mine, and just a few days ago, I had a project with a band called the Horse Lords. Have you ever heard of them?
No, never heard of them.
Baltimore, but they're young group, very interesting, kind of minimal rock
I gotta
group.
check them out.
Yeah, you should definitely check them out. We
Horse
did
Lords, the name of them?
Horse Lords.
I got
They're
okay.
originally from Baltimore, but you'll find them on Bandcamp.
Okay, I'm gonna look them
We
up.
just did a project. We had some support from a foundation in Germany. They're based in Germany now. And we just did a concert and recorded a record just yesterday, in fact.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, there are some. Yeah, at the end of the month, I'm
That's
performing again with Konrad Sprenger. I
that's
also have some other
fantastic.
projects. What? Sorry.
That's great. You're still playing and active. Where in New York did you play? What
We played at Artist Space, which
okay.
is a very old institution. It used to be in on Hudson Street,
Okay.
and it's still in Tribeca. It's down. It's actually
Oh,
right
okay.
next to where the Mud Club was.
Oh, how about
It's an
that?
art space, obviously Artist Space. And the connection was, sorry, a an exhibition on Terry Fox, who was he was actually a sound artist before there was sound art as a
How about
category,
that? I gotta look
and
him
a
up.
visual artist with whom I was closely connected or close friends with. He died in 2008, and I was somehow involved a bit in making that possible. And then connected to that, I performed also. I don't know if you know Ellen Fullman, the long
No,
string instrument. So you
no.
can look on their website; you'll see
Okay.
about it. But that was a very nice ending to my tour, and this
Oh,
Konrad Sprenger from Berlin came and performed with me there.
okay.
But yes, I'm still performing.
That
I
is
have
great.
uh,
Fantastic
various,
that you're still active in music.
yeah,
It's and I'm
yeah.
glad I'm able to. I'm really this podcast is really about interviewing people like yourself, people that don't get enough of attention that should get, after all these years. So it's I'm hopefully to do Ernie Brooks also.
Oh, say hello to
Yeah,
Ernie.
I will. He's coming on.
I
And there's
know
a
him.
guy.
What?
Go ahead.
Now he could tell you a lot about Arthur.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sure he
I know Arthur
will.
very well. Yeah,
I was very intrigued. That book is really great. In
yeah.
fact, I'm hoping to have Tim Lawrence on.
Oh, he's a
Uh,
great person. Yeah. So yeah.
and were you familiar with Can? Did you the band Can? Did you?
I mean, when I came to Berlin, when I came to Germany, a lot of people said you got to hear Can, and I listened
Right,
to various records, but I never had personal connection. So
right.
I know people who knew them. Uh, it's interesting because there's a whole parallel scene here.
How about that?
Tangerine Dream and all these
Oh
different.
yeah,
Yeah,
right,
but yeah, there are others who. Yeah, so I mean, to some degree, parallel worlds. So to some degree, influenced by Americans, not, but having their own character.
right,
I think though that I remain kind of, I sort of always seen as kind of coming out of American minimalism and the New York scene.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a guy out of New York I just interviewed, Bob Bellarue. He's a noise composer. So it's all based on noise and sound. He uses different amplifiers. He's based in New York. I did an interview with him. You might
I
find
never
that
met him,
interesting.
but the name is familiar to me. I've seen his
A
name. Yeah.
festival every year, 3-day festival of all these kind of noise related
Right.
groups with test equipment, and then he's got different amplifiers that make sound. It was very intriguing.
Right. Right.
So I think we've run out of time here, Arnold, but it
Really.
was a real pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming on. You're a
Okay.
real
I'll look
pioneer.
up Liquid.
Look up Liquid, and we had very unique band.
Okay.
Nobody's been able to copy us our sound, and I have some videos on my YouTube site you can
Okay.
check.
Okay.
And I
Take
look up
care.
your
Thanks.
music. Okay, take care now.
Take care. Yeah.
Nice seeing
Okay.
you.
Bye.
See you. Bye bye.